Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening to all of you who are joining us around the world for this press conference launching the 5th edition of Global Biodiversity Outlook. My name is David Ainsworth, and I'm the Information Officer of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So some of you are joining us today on the GoToWebinar platform, and a number of you are joining us on the live YouTube broadcast off the CBD website. Let me give you a bit of a running through for today's press conference, and then we'll take it away. So first of all, I'd like to welcome the distinguished panelists who will be not only here to present GBO5, but will also be taking your questions at the end of it. We have Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, who is the Executive Secretary to the Convention on Biological Diversity. We are also delighted to have Inger Anderson, who is the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme. We also have the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, David Cooper. We have the Chair of the subsidiary body on science, technical and technological advice of the Convention, Ezequiel Benitez. And we also are delighted to have the Executive Secretary of IPBES, Anne Larigauderie. So they will all be providing remarks to you and taking your questions later on. For today's press conference, the running order will be the following. We'll take some remarks from the Executive Secretary to the Convention on Biological Diversity, followed by comments and remarks by the Executive Director of UNEP. Following that, the Deputy Executive Secretary, David Cooper, will provide you a presentation of slides outlining the main messages of Global Biodiversity Outlook 5. That'll be followed by commentary and a rejoinder by Ezequiel Benitez, the Chair of SUBSTA, and by Anne Larigauderie, the Executive Secretary of IPBES. That should leave us around 45 minutes for questions to follow. Let me just remind all of you watching this webcast that all of the materials for the report are now public. The report, the summary, the news release, and visual media materials can be downloaded from the website of the convention, but also at the link bit.ly/GBO5media. And we'll be putting those links up in a variety of different chat boxes for you as well. Those of you who are attending the webinar can submit your questions via the question function that we have right here. Or those of you who are watching on YouTube can submit questions by email to gbo5@cbd.int or on the YouTube discussion group. The staff will then be directing these and will be asking these to the questioners as well. So let's get started without further ado. And I would like to introduce Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, who will start out our press conference talking about GBO5. Elizabeth, you have the floor.
Thank you. Greetings to you all. Humanity stands at a crossroads with regard to the legacy it leaves behind to future generations. It has been 10 years since the adoption in Nagoya, Japan of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020. Since that moment, governments and actors across the world have taken significant actions to address biodiversity crisis. This edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook that we launched today demonstrate that these actions have had meaningful impacts, and the biodiversity of our world would be in a worse shape without these efforts. But I need to be brutally honest. In the final reckoning, the world has not met the Aichi biodiversity targets, nor are we on track to reach the 2050 vision for biodiversity. Biodiversity is declining at an unprecedented rate, and the pressures driving this decline are intensifying. This threatens the achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals and undermines efforts to address climate change. The COVID-19 pandemic has further highlighted the importance of the relationship between people and nature, and it reminds us all of the profound consequences of our own well-being and survival that can result from continued biodiversity loss and degradation of the ecosystems. Three key lessons emerge from the research in the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5 and inform the actions that we must all take. First, governments need to scale up national ambitions to protect nature and ensure all necessary resources are mobilized so that the action they achieve at national level has the scope of the global targets. Secondly, countries need to work more to bring biodiversity into the center of decision-making in all aspects of life, of the government, and of our economies, so that the root causes of biodiversity loss are addressed. And finally, we need to work to address the multiple challenges we face in achieving sustainable development, slowing climate change, and reversing biodiversity loss. These changes are needed in every aspect of people's relationship with nature. As we prepare for a new global biodiversity framework to guide actions over the next decades, we must recommit to the vision adopted in Nagoya in 2010. It remains as valid as ever within the broader aspirations expressed in the Sustainable Development Goals. It also remains achievable, but only if we work to achieve the transformative change. As we emerge from the COVID-19 crisis, the world hopes that a better, greener future can follow based on human societies living on a healthy planet that supports healthy lives. The decisions facing us at the next UN Biodiversity Conference offer an opportunity to start on the road of building that better, greener, and sustainable future. Let us make the commitments and take the necessary actions to make our shared vision a reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Executive Secretary. It's my pleasure now to invite Inger Anderson, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, to speak. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, and to members of the media, colleagues. As we heard right now from the Executive Secretary of the CBD Convention, we've known for a long time that biodiversity and the services that it provides have been in decline. It's on this background that 10 years ago, the international community adopted the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020. The goal of that plan and its Aichi targets was to halt biodiversity loss and to ensure that ecosystems continue to provide essential services. Governments and the wider society have acted to some extent to address the biodiversity crisis. Some nations have made some progress, which we applaud. However, as we just heard right now from Mrs. Marema, the report card on the global progress, we have not met the Aichi biodiversity targets, and we're not on track for the 2050 vision for biodiversity. Now, many may have heard myself and my fellow speakers today speak of the devastating consequences of humanity's imprint on nature, in particular, timely and obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic, a zoonotic disease that is transmitted between animals and humans, which is by no means the first and sadly, probably not the last. From COVID-19 to massive wildfires, to floods, melting glaciers, unprecedented heat, failure to meet the Aichi target and to protect our home has very, very real consequences. We can no longer afford to cast nature aside. Now is a time for this massive step up, conserving, restoring, and using biodiversity fairly and sustainably. If we do not, biodiversity will continue to buckle under the weight of land and sea use changes, overexploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. And that will further damage human health, economies, and societies with particular impact on indigenous communities. The Global Biodiversity Outlook that is being launched today spells out the transitions that can create a society living in harmony with nature. Transition is in how we use land and forests, how we organize our agriculture and our food supply systems, how we manage fisheries, how we use water, how we manage the urban environment, and how we tackle climate change. There are many examples of that show how the right policies can bring about a positive outcome. For example, where fisheries have been regulated and reported and monitored, abundance of stocks have improved. Where coordinated action has been taken to slow deforestation, habitat loss has been controlled. Ecosystem restoration, when implemented effectively with the support of local populations, has reversed decades of degradation. To knit the global response together, therefore, UN member states will soon adopt the post-2020 biodiversity framework. In the framework, we need to be ambitious, we need to be clear, and we need clear and common targets for a nature-positive world. Targets that can be broken down and implemented at the national level. Targets that can be added up so that we know whether we are on track to meet the goals that we will set. We need financing, capacity development, transparency, and accountability. And we need buy-in from the sectors and groups, such as infrastructure, agriculture, government, business, finance, that drive or control biodiversity loss. This may seem like a tall order, but I believe that protecting nature is entirely within humanity's reach. There is today a far deeper understanding of what nature's loss means for our health and our well-being, for regulating our climate, for ensuring that our skies are raining. Businesses can no longer afford to ignore the risk of biodiversity loss on profitability. And as we are seeing countries and companies and financiers beginning to lean in on the nature agenda, we can see that this is doable. As we stretch in the climate change context on the national determined contributions, the NDCs, we have a very real shot at embedding ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solutions into climate action. We don't need to wait for the biodiversity framework to do that. We need to begin now, and then we need the ambitious framework. As the UN Secretary General has noted, this is a make or break moment for the planet. As we seek to reboot economic recovery following the COVID-19 pandemic, how we prioritize and direct our resources will either secure human economic and environmental health for generations to come, or take us down the gray path that has brought with it the suffering that we are seeing today. Ladies and gentlemen, we have little choice but to take the right path, and I trust that we will do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Executive Director. Thank you for talking about the linkage between all the other agendas before us. I'd like to turn now to a presentation of the contents, findings and conclusions of Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, delivered by the Deputy Executive Secretary, David Cooper. I believe he started to share his screen. One thing, David, is right now we just see your press order, so we've let people behind the curtain a little bit. You'll just have to put your slides up now. There we go. I think we're almost there. Good. We see the slides now. Go right ahead, David. Your presentation's up.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you, others. As we have heard already, the Global Biodiversity Outlook provides a report card on how countries have done in achieving the Aichi biodiversity targets and looks to the future and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The report builds on a whole range of national reports and national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and of course the IPBES global assessment, as well as the latest research and indicator information. It's divided in 3 main sections, and I'll take you through each of them very quickly now. The first section looks at the importance of biodiversity for sustainable development and explores the relationship with the Sustainable Development Goals. 3 main points. Biodiversity is foundational to the Sustainable Development Goals, and its loss therefore jeopardizes achievement of many of them. But also, the Sustainable Development Agenda is itself important in providing an enabling framework for achieving our biodiversity goals. The second part of the Global Biodiversity Outlook is given a report card on progress towards the Aichi biodiversity targets. For each of the 20 targets that were adopted in Nagoya 10 years ago, we provide a summary of progress for the target as a whole and for each element using this colored semicircle chart. We also show the information towards national targets. The indicator-based information focuses in particular on information over the last 2 decades and changes since 2010. So this is the overall scorecard for the 20 targets. As the Executive Secretary has already indicated, none of them are fully achieved. 6 of them are partially achieved. That's indicated by the green segments in the chart before you. For instance, under target 11, a lot of progress has been made in expanding protected areas at land and at sea, and these elements of the target will be achieved this year. We also see progress in implementation of the Convention's protocol, the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing, in the development of national biodiversity strategies and action plans, target 17, in biodiversity information, target 19, and in biodiversity finance, target 20. But at the other end of the spectrum, if you look at the red segments, you'll see also areas where we have not made progress globally. I'll highlight just one now under target 3, where generally countries have failed to address incentives that are harmful to biodiversity. We are still spending 500 billion a year on such incentives, swamping the amount spent on supporting biodiversity. In this slide, you'll see a lot of yellow. That means progress has been made, but not at rates sufficient to achieve the targets. But as the Executive Secretary and the Executive Director already mentioned, behind that limited progress, we do see important signs which can encourage us and which show that if measures are implemented, they do work. For instance, target 5, while we haven't achieved a 50% reduction in the rate of deforestation and the loss of other habitats as the target requires, deforestation rates in the last 5 years are a third lower than they were the decade before. And we've seen particularly strong progress in South America in this regard. For fish stocks, although overall a third of fish stocks are overfished, and that figure is a little higher than it was 5 years ago, we are seeing where good fisheries management actions are put in place, we do see a recovery of fish stocks, of fish biomass. And conservation actions are estimated to have prevented between 28 and 48 bird and mammal species from going extinct since 1993 when the CBD came into force, including between 11 and 25 since 2010. The extinction rate, though worrying, has therefore been, would have been between 2 and 4 times higher without such actions. Even where we have seen progress, and this slide shows 2 examples that I mentioned earlier with respect to national biodiversity strategies and action plans and with finance, we have important lessons. One is that we need to make sure that we have a fast start in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. The second is that we need finance beyond the levels we already have. While financial resources were doubled in the last 10 years, international financial resources were doubled in the last 10 years, they still are below what is required. Moving to the future and to looking at pathways towards the 2050 vision. The latest science shows us that if we take actions, if we put in place the transformational changes needed, it is possible to reduce and ultimately bend the curve of biodiversity loss, to put nature on a path to recovery towards the 2050 vision. But this will require a whole range of actions. Conservation and restoration is essential, but it needs to be backed up by other actions. Climate change is not currently the largest driver of biodiversity loss, but will become so unless we take strong action to keep climate change below 2 degrees and close to 1.5. We will need to address the other drivers of biodiversity loss too, and this means addressing agricultural productivity, which will need to increase, and reducing overall consumption and waste. In the report, we show how these changes can play out in 8 areas of transition, which the Executive Director mentioned already. For lack of time, I will not go through all of them, but highlight 3 of them. Key will be reforming food systems, rebalancing agricultural policies and incentives, promoting the availability, access to, and consumption of diets that are both healthy and sustainable, and promoting measures to reduce food waste and encouraging businesses to promote sustainability across supply chains. Another important area is how we address climate change. Nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based solutions can be up to 1/3 of the efforts needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this involves increased efforts in conservation, reducing deforestation, ecosystem restoration, and we are about to enter the UN decade of ecosystem restoration, and reducing losses from agriculture. Finally, we highlight the links with health. There is no doubt, and there's increasing evidence, that degradation of ecosystems, encroachment into natural areas, unregulated wildlife trade, all increase the risk of emergence of diseases such as the one we are now suffering from. Investing in nature, reducing deforestation, regulating wildlife trade will reduce the risk of future pandemics. But there are also many other links between biodiversity and human health. We need to address the common drivers of biodiversity loss, disease risk, ill health, and climate change. All of these interactions, all of these transitions are interacted. We need a whole of government, whole of society approach to promote the transformational changes needed. In summary, none of the Aichi targets have been fully met, but there are many examples of success. Policy measures do work where they're put in place. It is possible to reduce and reverse biodiversity loss and put nature on a path to recovery, but that will require strong conservation and restoration activities addressing all the drivers of biodiversity loss, and it will require changes in consumption and production patterns. As others have emphasized, the time for action is now. We have the opportunity to invest in nature, not only to reduce the risk of the 6 mass extinction, but to contribute to food security, to reduce the risk of future pandemics, and to contribute to the climate agenda. These are some of the lessons for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, David Cooper, Deputy Executive Secretary, for that outline of GBO5. I'd like to now turn to the chair of the convention's subsidiary body for science, Hezekiah Benitez. This report was launched in the context of a SBSTA meeting, and so now we'll get some remarks from him. Hezekiah, Mr. Chair, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to, well, we saw the presentation with a lot of information on the unfortunate situation of our planet. Science is telling us about the strong damage to nature since humans inhabit this planet. It's amazing how nowadays we have 1 million species in danger and 3/4 of land surface already transformed severely, and the declining of many ecosystem services that are important for human well-being. We also review how our convention is performing and implementing the AG targets, and as the Executive Secretary said, is being brutally honest, no target was achieved properly, and this is very serious. Only few had limited progress. We are now in depth with nature, and we have to do something seriously. We know the drivers of biodiversity loss. We have tools, we have technology, satellites, images to tell us how are we precisely, in more detail, still damaging our planet. We know the way to go forward. We know about the transitions that we need to do. We know the drivers of biodiversity loss that we need to address, but we really need to connect seriously. We need to put all together. We need to take full responsibility of our actions every day. This is not a matter of somebody else. This should be something personal, where we all need to do together. We need to bring all people to take the right path. And we need to work now and seriously, as David says, the time to action is now. So what else do we need to know, and how can we really get conscious about what we need to do in order to restore and to be full responsibilities in our every actions. So information is there. What we need to do is there. We need really political will, and as citizens and inhabitants of this planet, we need to have responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have the honor now to invite Anne Larigaud-Dury, who's the Executive Secretary at IPBES. As we all know, the Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services was issued last year and was important input for this. Anne, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and greetings to all participants from around the world. It's a pleasure to speak on the occasion of the launch of this 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook. And IPBES is, of course, proud to have greatly contributed to this report through its assessments, and in particular through the release of the Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, released last year and strategically timed to contribute to this GBO5 towards COP15. Additional important features of the GBO5 also include an interesting analysis of the 6 national reports that have been submitted to the CBD by all governments around the world. As has been said before, the conclusions of the GBO5 unfortunately confirm and also complement those of the IPBES global assessment, namely that none of the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets will be met fully in 2020, this year, and that only a handful will be partially achieved. Also, that we know what needs to be done, that also has been said, and that really includes having influence acting on the direct causes of biodiversity loss. We mentioned agriculture, fisheries, climate change, pollution, and invasive species, but also, and perhaps more importantly, to act on the indirect causes of biodiversity loss, those that have to do with our economies, with our institutions, with our governance, and really ultimately with the way we value natures, our own systems of valuation of nature, and also our own behaviors. It is not too late to act. In fact, the GBO5 provides many encouraging examples of where when measures have been taken, they have led to successes and biodiversity does bounce back. So IBES will inform the transition to sustainable pathways in this post-2020 biodiversity. IBES is preparing for two reports in that context, one on transformative change at the heart of this global conversation, and the second one on how to simultaneously reach the Sustainable Development Goals that are related to biodiversity, climate change, food, water, health, and energy, using this nexus approach, meaning looking at interlinkages so that we become able to reach all of them together in a coherent manner rather than some at the expense of others. And there is also a third topic that will come shortly on the impact and dependence of business on biodiversity. As has been said, there has never been a more crucial time to transform the way we relate to nature, and the COVID-19 pandemic has proven again how the destruction of nature can affect every life of every person on this planet. So as demonstrated by the IBES report and by this GBO5, biodiversity holds the solution to our most pressing development needs and issues related to poverty, to hunger, to water quality and quantity, to health and climate change. So conserving and using nature sustainably are no longer optional. So in conclusion, IBES looks forward to informing the implementation of an ambitious and well-resourced post-2020 biodiversity framework, one that will really allow the world to reach all of the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda for people and for our planet. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Anne. Much appreciated. And I'd just like to indicate that we also have the chair of IBES in our audience. She's not here on the panel, but she's watching in as well, interestedly. So thank you very much to our panelists. We're now going to turn to the questions. We've already received a number of questions from the chat box here and online. I'll direct this to our various panelists over the next little while. We'll be continuing to receive questions from the reporters. We'll do our best to answer them as we move forward. So the first question comes from Tetsuji Ida of Kyodo News Japan. It's got multi-parts, and I think I'll direct this first one, I guess, really to the Executive Secretary and the Deputy Executive Secretary. And he's interested in some of the learning lessons we have from the Aichi targets. You know, do you think that the next 10-year targets need to be more simple and action-oriented? And similar to that, what's the most important element of the coming post-Aichi framework? I'll let Elizabeth and David do a combination answer on that, as they tend to do with these. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Useful question. What will happen the next 10 years? Indeed, simple targets are key, but I think what is also important is to learn from why we fail to achieve the current biodiversity Aichi targets. We need to learn from the past. And as David had indicated in the presentation, one lesson we've learned was the late start of the implementation. So this time we want to ensure the implementation begin immediately as the framework, as soon as the framework is adopted, and not 5 years later. 1, 2, of course, other lessons which are already being considered as the new framework is developed, which were missing during the Aichi target, is a package of particularly the review mechanism, monitoring and reporting. How do we hold ourselves accountable as the implementation process goes by? How do we report on what we do so that we are able to progressively measure whether we are doing well or not? And therefore, the framework, new framework, is looking at having a review mechanism, having a resource mobilization strategy, having a capacity building framework as part of it. Again, lessons learned from the Aichi biodiversity targets implementation. David?
Thank you, Elizabeth. So I think two things. One, yes, the targets need to be simple, but they need to address not only conservation and restoration, but also how we address those underlying drivers. Secondly, targets alone, as you said, will not give us the change needed. We need to make sure, and I would just reinforce what you've said about the need for strong review mechanisms and strong implementation support so that we can get a fast start and so that countries have the resources needed to implement the new plan when it's adopted. And finally, given that we need a whole of government, whole of society approach, we need heads of state and government to take personal charge of the next plan. And hopefully they will begin to do that, as the executive director also said, ahead of the adoption of the framework starting at the end of this month at the UN summit that's being held by the General Assembly. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. There's one more part to the question from Tetsuji, but it's also reflected in a question from Monica Medina of Our Daily Planet. And this is about the question of protected areas. As we know, there is a proposal right now in the zero draft of looking at up to 30% of the planet as protected areas. And so for this one, I'm wondering if I can get, I guess we'll get David and then also Hezekiah to comment on this too. Is that 30% sufficient? Do we need more than that? And what about this question of protecting half of the earth? So we'll start with David and then Hezekiah will go on after that. Thank you.
So certainly protecting 30% of the planet would be consistent with the changes we need to put biodiversity on a path to recovery. But it really matters where that 30% is. And in fact, perhaps making sure that we cover the areas that are key to biodiversity, but also key to the continued provision of ecosystem services is at least as important, perhaps more than important than just the simple figure of the area that we conserve. And the other, of course, is just to note that whatever we do with protected areas, essential as it is, it has to be complemented by actions across the sectors, across the economies. The report explores the different implications of an approach moving towards half Earth or an approach where we are, as it's referred to in the report, sharing the planet between productive ecosystems and protected areas. There are pros and cons, there are trade-offs among those different approaches. And certainly it will be important in any of these approaches to make sure that we continue to invest to improve agricultural productivity and sustainability so that we can achieve the conservation goals that we need at the same time as supporting food security. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much. Hezekiah, could we ask you to comment?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think this is a case-by-case situation. We need to see, as David mentioned, there are some regions and species that are highly trained and is urgent to establish conservation actions. However, alone itself, it will not work if it's not combined with a number of actions around to reduce drivers of biodiversity loss like pressures from invasive species or pollutions or overexploitations. And this has to be also linked to sustainable use. areas of sustainable use that can allow ecosystem services outside protected areas to protect protected areas is very important. So this is something broader. It should be conservation and sustainable use together all around the planet. It's not only 30% or 50%. It should be combined with our habits in dealing with nature. This is, I don't believe necessarily a number will be the solution. It should be a combination to ensure a continuity of all landscapes in all ecosystems, ensuring proper conservation and sustainable use, allowing the right functioning of ecosystems and the services provides for human well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Our next question is directed towards Executive Director Anderson. This comes from Seth Bornstein, who is the science writer at the Associated Press. He picks up on your comments in the beginning. He says that given that carbon emissions aren't dropping, except as a tiny blip during the pandemic, and also given that these latest updates we get from the Convention of Biological Diversity show that only 6 of the targets are met. So his question, it's a hard one. Do you think the world is failing in its efforts to protect the environment? And are leaders like yourselves also failing? So a hard one to you. Thank you.
I think it's a very fair question, because clearly we haven't reached where we want to be, Seth, and so there is a global failure at play. And as we see with the Aichi targets, we agreed 10 years ago where we were going to land, and now we can see we're not landing there. So we have to ask ourselves, what are those lessons that we can learn, both within the various organizations where we sit in the societies and how we approved them last time. And here, just to go back to the earlier questions on lessons learned, it's not enough to agree on this new set of targets, whatever they will be, within the environment ministry sector. It has to be a whole of cabinet approach. It has to deal with infrastructure and agriculture and fisheries. And I can say that that was not the case previously, that indeed many of these other ministries were not aware of the commitments that were made. A further thing that we need to understand, and maybe take a lesson out of the climate lesson learning, is that the targets, the new targets, as I think Elizabeth, or was it David who said, we have to be able to add them up. But we also have to be able to disaggregate them at the national level. And then we have to be able to see whether we are actually beginning to meet the targets. The NDCs is an interesting example, isn't it? Because we can say, oh, we're not on target, we need to stretch further. And this needs to be a conversation that takes us way beyond the environment bubble where I sit and where, to extent, you sit, Seth. And then finally, just to say that on the issue of the size of targets, 30%, 50%, half Earth, etc., the quality of what we protect is representation, but more importantly, what we don't protect. What is it that lies outside protection, where we are losing biodiversity at the highest rate? What are we going to do that's different in agriculture? What are we going to do that's different in infrastructure? What are we going to do that's different in urbanization? How can we avoid that we fragment? These are the kind of questions that we need to take into urban planning, into land use management, into all of these sectors. And I would say there we have not succeeded. And that's an important role on which we have to tackle. Back over to you, David.
Thank you very, very much. Our next question comes from Laurie Goering of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. She points out that the report says that the essential role of women in underpinning actions for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity have been consistently undervalued. She's wondering, can the panelists provide examples of how this gap will have impeded our progress toward biodiversity goals, and how it might be changed, and how things are looking for that? Can I bring that first to the Executive Secretary, and then we'll take it for another panelist afterwards. Elizabeth, you have the floor.
Thank you, David. I think that's the fair assessment, and it is also in the report itself. And it's not just women, but basically I would say a number of what I would call vulnerable groups, indigenous peoples and local communities, the youth and others. And that's why the next biodiversity framework will be universal in its application. and not just the expectation as we had the biodiversity targets, where it was assumed that the implementation was only by the governments and other stakeholders were not involved, or other sectors, as Inga just alluded, were not involved. So ensuring universality, ensuring all stakeholders are involved and engaged in the development of the post-2020 framework, these again are part of the lessons being carried forward. And indeed, the women, the indigenous peoples, local communities, the youth have currently really been engaged in the development process of the new framework. Lessons learned, and hope we'll do better in the future. Over.
Thank you very much. Can I turn to Anne? Anne, can you react to this question too?
Yes, thank you. Perhaps I can develop a little bit more the indigenous and local knowledge component that Elizabeth just mentioned in the reports that IBES has been doing, and therefore in the GBO5, we have really implemented an approach that was approved by the plenary of IBES on using indigenous and local knowledge in all of our reports. This is an approach which includes a continuum of steps from the very beginning of an assessment where indigenous people and local communities are invited together with scientists to help define the questions and with governments, and then throughout the various drafts where they have the possibility to comment on the drafts as they evolve and provide their views. And in the end, when we go back to the community, as we say, we give back and we explain how the knowledge that they have been contributing to has been used and what are the implications for indigenous people and local communities on the ground. And so this inclusivity has been underlined also by the GBO5 as a criteria for success in all of the policies, that if you involve all of the stakeholders at the local level in particular, you really increase your chances of long-term success in all of the measures that you will be putting in place.
Thank you very, very much, Anne. Let's see here. Can I get one more reaction? Let's see here. David, can I get one more reaction about the gender element of this before I move to the next question? Thank you.
Yeah, certainly for good management of biodiversity, the gender perspective is really important. There's an example in the report of, for instance, of where the failure to take into account the use of marine resources, fisheries, by women resulted in mismanagement, simply because what they were doing was invisible in the official statistics, and this happens a lot. So women often have a disproportionately important role in managing biodiversity, in using non-wood forest products, for instance, in using food resources that may not feature in national accounts and are often ignored. So good attention is needed for that, for proper management. And more generally, we highlight, in fact, the importance of gender equality to provide the right enabling environment to be able to implement biodiversity actions. And the SDG on gender equality here is essential if we want to achieve our conservation and broader biodiversity goals.
Executive Director, can we get your comment for this question?
I think my colleagues have pretty much made it very clear. Look, women are often, especially in poorer countries, the stewards of the immediacies of the land, of household gardens. They're often the keepers of seeds. They're often the providers and the knowers of medicinal values of various trees and plants, and they are often those to whom the least amount of agricultural input for higher productivity are provided. They're often those, however, who provide for and manage the the nutrition dimension of society, providing food and nutrition for families. And so understanding that that biodiversity loss and loss of that kind of knowledge is a loss for the family unit, but also a loss for women's abilities to control part of society and their in the elements that they manage: family, small farming, agriculture, medicine, nutrition is critical. So coming back to knowledge and power, if you like, these are the two elements that that have a sort of red line here. And so ensuring that biodiversity protection, that one takes into account that knowledge and respects that knowledge, but also its continuity becomes critical. So seeing biodiversity through a gender lens, at times outsiders may look upon that is very constructed, but in fact, to a poor woman in a rural setting in Africa who's managing these things, this becomes very real. And that is often also, of course, where wealth is generated, through production of medicines, through production of foods for sale at local markets, etc. So it's also about empowerment. So biodiversity loss together with local knowledge becomes a critical element, and losses, and therefore a dimension to gender that we must not overlook. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Executive Director. So the next question actually is it covers a lot of ground. It looks at questions of mainstreaming. It looks at the question of the role of the incoming presidency, China. So I'm going to read the question out, but I expect we'll get answers from all of our panelists. The question comes from Dong Feng of the Global Times World from China. And so Dong Feng writes that a major global driver of infrastructure development across Asia, Europe, and China, or Asia, Europe, and Africa, pardon me, China's $6 trillion Belt and Road Initiative presents many potential risks for biodiversity. New cooperative modes of governance will be needed to mitigate these. However, currently there are few safeguards for biodiversity in the lending requirements applied by the institutions providing finance for the initiative. And so Dong Feng asked for some specific examples or suggestions do you have? And so I think because this addresses questions of mainstreaming, finance resources, we'll do a round robin on it if we could. Executive Secretary, can we have you start in the answer to this question, please?
Thank you very much for that useful question. The Belt and Road is a huge investment, infrastructural investment. And looking at the environmental side, biodiversity side, one key element to look at, and especially where the projects will be, the countries which will be engaged with that project in addition to China, are the issues related to environmental impact assessment or nature impact assessment, strategic impact assessments, to be able to mitigate any environmental impacts which may be associated with that investment. And when you look at the impact issues, those will be also issues related to land tenure issues, related to the stakeholder involvement, be it women, be it the local communities, be it also the government itself. This is where the issue of mention of mainstreaming, that is not just the environment, but all of government, all of society engagement in the impact assessment will need to be part of the engagement before putting in the investments needed and before beginning that infrastructure as expected. So we hope these measures are already looked at. I know even UNEP has been engaged. I'm sure also other partners, just to make sure we are doing the right thing in terms of impacts which may be involved with the investment. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. We'll have David provide a response, and then immediately after that, I'd like the Executive Director, if she could, to speak. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So clearly, in fact, when we look generally between now and 2050, most of the infrastructure that will be there in 2050 is yet to be built. And the Belt and Road Initiative is obviously an important example of that. It's important, of course, what is built, but it's also important for biodiversity and ecosystems of where it is built and how. And if you're building a road or a power line, for instance, the routing of that can be really important in terms of its impact on biodiversity, and also incidentally on the impact on the integrity of ecosystems more broadly, which has consequences also for the risk of future disease emergence. So there's every reason to plan carefully. And the executive director referred earlier to investing more in good planning and good spatial planning, and we certainly need that. The questioner is correct. I mean, currently, of the 65 financiers that have been identified in studies that we looked at for the report, only 17 require biodiversity impact mitigation. So there's definitely room for improving the safeguards that we have over this initiative and many others. The good news is, if you look in China, some of China's own infrastructure development, especially recent infrastructure development, has followed best practices in terms of siting of new roads and mitigation measures put in place. So, and we know that China's committed to ensure the environmental sustainability of the Belt and Road Initiative. So there's everything to play for in this case.
Thank you, David. Executive Director.
Thank you. The first thing is probably to be mindful that, and this question came from China, so once infrastructure, the footprint is down, it's probably for the long haul. Think the Great Wall of China. These things stay. My own city in my country, Copenhagen, the footprint went down in between 1,000 and 1,400. It's still there. So infrastructure footprint and where we put it has permanency in a temporal sense that we need to be, as David said, very mindful of. And that means like careful planning, et cetera, as was mentioned. But at the same time, we need to be very careful that we understand that Africa, for example, has a huge infrastructure gap, and it's very easy to sit in our high rises with our running water and our electricity and our flush toilets and have views about this. So we need to understand, and the African Development Bank estimates that Africa's infrastructure gap is around 100 billion a year in terms of investment needed. We also need to understand that investment for infrastructure does not only come from China, it comes from many other sides, and it is all of that infrastructure that we need to get onto that environmental and social platform that will make assessments, that will prevent fragmentation, that will be nature positive, but that will also support developments. So the recognition then that we can do urban planning in one way or in another. You can have greater density, you can have less land gobbled up on the rural periphery, on the urban rural periphery, by smart planning. You can ensure that you avoid fragmentation. You can, when there is fragmentation, take it underground if it's a railway or a metro. So there are many ways of doing this that you can minimize impact on nature, and obviously ensuring that if there is negative impact, which there might very well be, that you do offset, and that you do offset in appropriate, responsible manner. So these are the kind of things that we need to understand, and I think it's less. It is about ensuring that since most financing for infrastructure comes from the public side and not from the private side, it's about 90% is public investment. That means then that governments have a responsibility, if they've signed up to certain treaties, certain conventions, certain standards, that the financing that they provide lives up to those standards too. So there's a lot of work to be done. and I think this question is very pertinent because there's much more that we can do to minimize impacts.
Thank you very much. Can I turn to Anne for some comments, and then we'll close out this question with Ezekiel afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I have very little to add to the comprehensive responses that were made by my colleagues, just to flag that the promoting sustainable energy and infrastructure project and production is something that has been really highlighted as a key activity towards sustainable development. And perhaps we will be talking a bit later, perhaps in the context of another question, about also improving the sustainability of our economic and financial systems, because we've been talking here a little bit about finances, but here what the report really illustrates is that even though we really have had an increase in the funding for conservation and restoration of biodiversity, it is dwarfed by the huge amounts of funds that are still going into harming biodiversity and into supporting the wrong things, such as the use of pesticides, for example, or overfishing, which harm biodiversity. And that's also a component of that conversation about funding and finances.
Thank you. Ezekiel.
Yeah, thank you very much. This has to be more with the concept of mainstreaming. What do we mean by that? Which also involves inclusiveness and working together towards the same path. This applies also to production of food. So how are we doing agriculture, fisheries, forestry, tourism, generation of energy, infrastructure? Of course, all of this impacts biodiversity. In some cases, there are trade-offs that we should be aware of that, and how to minimize this, how to responsibly do risk assessments, to applicate measures and regulations in order to include in all these activities actions for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in a conscious way, not as a circumstantial matter, but clearly know the impact, clearly know how can we improve the situation and the conditions of ecosystem services, and on a day-by-day basis. And we cannot stop producing food. Even population is growing in the planet. So the demand in the future for food and energy will increase. How are we going to cover these demands? By maintaining an equilibrium in the ecosystems. This is part of mainstreaming, and we need to work together and not to fight environmentalists against people in the industry. So we need to work together to see what is the best way to do things. And this applies to the example in China and many other places all around the planet. So we need to be conscious and do teamwork seriously.
Thank you very much, Ezekiel. And your experience working in Mexico on mainstreaming across a number of sectors is some of the firsthand experience for that. Maybe just to chain together another question, and I'll put this to Elizabeth and David, is Catherine Early of China Dialogue is picking up a bit on this idea of mainstreaming. And she's interested to know, what the Secretariat, but I think we can take it more broadly, is what is being done to engage government departments outside of those dealing directly with the environment and biodiversity issues. As we know, it's departmental, but it's definitely siloed in one thing. So I guess Elizabeth, David, will get some comments from you about a little bit about this whole of government approach first. Thanks.
Thank you, David. In terms of ensuring that we get the whole of government, we have a full program within the Secretariat on mainstreaming. And through that program is where then, as we have and engage our parties through the focal points in our different activities, projects, events, is to encourage also other sectors to equally be engaged. And we also have a specific program, for instance, local governments, subnational governments at national level, bringing them together again to engage in biodiversity matters. So we are trying, but of course, as the Secretariat, still at national level, our entry point are the focal points, majority of which are departments and ministries of environment. But through them, of course, getting other government departments. And such events as the one we have now, and through our subsidiary bodies, we have seen more and more other government departments getting involved and engaged. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, David.
So, yeah, just adding to that, and of course our mainstreaming program that Elizabeth outlined, it's very much thanks to the efforts made by the parties, and particularly by Mexico in hosting COP13 and really pushing this agenda, and in bringing, at that point in particular, agriculture, fisheries and forests, which, as we know, are the key sectors, as well as tourism on the agenda. And then at COP14, thanks to our hosts there, Egypt, bring in other sectors, including infrastructure that we were just talking about. And I think beyond that, we also, as I mentioned earlier, we need heads of governments to take charge and to make sure that this isn't expected to be something that can be pushed, as Inga mentioned also earlier, only by environment ministers. It needs all of the ministries involved in government, and then through them, we need to reach out, of course, to all of the sectors. We also work at our level with the other UN bodies that interact with these sectors, such as the Food and Agriculture Organization, such as the World Health Organization. We need to, engage more with finance ministries and those ministers responsible for economic development and planning. And I think some of the messages that we highlight in the report about, that biodiversity, it's important for its own sake. We want to prevent the sixth mass extinction, but ultimately it underpins everything that we regard as important. And so making sure that message is widely out there is going to be key too.
Thank you very much. Executive Director, can we get you to comment, because UNEP does work across all of these different areas and fields and is faced with this challenge of silos and working departments. Can we get UNEP's take on this way of bringing together a whole of government approach?
I think there is a real opportunity right now, and that is in the context of the stimulus packages. And so I think that what we need to understand, yes, there is with these, what is it, we looked, $15 trillion worth that has gone into the global economy, and this money is yours and mine. It came from taxpayers, right? So this is not, this is money that has been contributed to states or by taxpayers. So understanding where that money goes, but that is now. And so I think I hope, in our lifetime, and certainly not this past century, have we in the last 100 years seen so much money being taken from the public purse into the economy. And the question then is, what will we, thinking about mainstreaming, what are we going to say to that? And how are we going to make that part of the solution? Because otherwise I fear that mainstreaming will be somewhat of an abstract situation, but there is a here and now. And so understanding that, yes, the first thing of the stimulus is, of course, to help the health ministries, is, of course, to help those who have lost their jobs and cannot feed their families and pay their rent. Don't get me wrong, cut those checks, get them to people, etc. But thereafter, when investments start rolling out, what kind of investments is it going to be? Like Anne was saying before, is it going to be renewable investments in energy, or is it going to be coal-powered plants? I go back to my infrastructure story. A coal-powered power plant has a lifetime span of around 50 years. So and 10 years planning. So you're talking from today, 60 years out, you're still running that thing. So let's think about time, the temporal nature of this, and let's think about right now ensuring that the kind of stimulus packages that are rolling out that they have a nature positive dimensions. And this can be, there's a whole wave of options. Pakistan, for example, pushed out a package that included support to the billion tree tsunami, i.e. getting money into people's pockets. Yes, by doing what? By planting trees, native trees, right? Kenya has done quite a lot on restoration of parks, etc. So it can be at that level, or it can be thinking big infrastructure and making that infrastructure positive. Because so that is, I would say, right now our primary conversation that we need to have on mainstreaming. Get real with these trillions of dollars that are slushing around and moving them into nature positive investments, and being mindful and engaging with influencers and policymakers to make that happen. So that would be my 2 cents on the trillions right now in terms of infrastructure. Back over to you, David.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to move to another question, I think, that links to this, but also comes back to some comments we had from Anne before. So link Anne start with this. This question comes from the YouTube channel. It's not attributed, so I'm not sure who asked it, but it's a good one. But they said they wanted to understand, do we really have a strong evidence of the relationship of biodiversity and production? And the question was asked because, according to this attendee's view, the productive sector doesn't seem to be so convinced about the importance of biodiversity's persistence. So Anne, we'll start with you, because you talked about the need to look at sustainable production and consumption. And I think these are some of the bigger questions about mainstream, but then again about this question about engagement with business and overall productive sectors. So let's start with Anne, and then I'm going to go to a round robin with this. Thank you. And are you back on?
I am now, yes, starting again. So yes, there is quite a bit of evidence that nature provides many contributions, including resources for many supply chains for different types of business sectors. In fact, that is something that IBES is going to look into, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, with more details. But that is really why the private sector also needs to embrace this issue of biodiversity. And I think that this is really what we're starting to see. And this is a very promising development. We see different types of businesses. I'm thinking, for example, about the fashion sector, just to give an example. And the fashion sector, as we know, is really using a lot of resources and a lot of energy, and is very unsustainable, and also promotes very unsustainable consumption patterns. And we see in the GBO5, in fact, examples of different types of global enterprises, global businesses with reaches in many different regions of the world, which are really reviewing all of their supply chains, how they purchase resources such as cotton, for example, or leather, perhaps, or the way they have been promoting deforestation in some cases, and are trying to no longer do that through their investments. So there is a lot of activities now from the private sector that is also very promising.
Great, thank you very, very much. This is a rich question here. I think I'll go to the Executive Secretary first, Elizabeth, and then we'll go to Inger after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will look at production together with consumption. When we look at food production, which takes us to agriculture, the land, the soil management, the pesticides on the land, and what comes out of the soil, which feeds itself, let's say, in the food systems, food chain to the consumers. Anne has mentioned the fashion industry, how much water, detergents, chemicals go into that production, which then comes to the consumption, us human beings, our choices, both of diets, our choices of what we wear, ensuring that they have come from sustainable farming. So I think we need also to play a role, even as individuals, in terms of putting pressure on the production systems because of our choices, which then will dictate the markets. And I think this will help us in that biodiversity sustainability or environmental sustainability moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Executive Director.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's true that there was a time when we meaning the global we, not necessarily the current company, there was an assumption that the resources of this good earth were inexhaustible and that you could extract, emit, cut down fish till the nth degree. And maybe that sense, therefore, that the productive sector didn't quite understand that nature, you can only push it so far into a corner. I do think, however, that SDG 12, sustainable consumption and production, the sustainable production and consumption, speaks to exactly this, our inexhaustible hunger, it appears, for more land, more extractives, more timber, more fish in the sea, etc. There's a realization that is not possible, and therefore driving this understanding that we have to have much greater circularity. We can no longer sort of take out of the environment, use and discard back into the environment. There is an understanding that you take stuff out of the planet, you need to keep it in the economy, and not for a short time, but in permanence to the extent possible. And that means an entire redesign of how we do stuff. Metals cannot just be discarded. We need to not over-dimension how much steel we use into one construction or another. We need to ensure that what we have taken out of the environment into the economy does not get discarded back into the environment, but stays in the economy. And I think Anne mentioned a very good example of some of the sustainable consumption patterns, that, for example, fashion, etc. But the same thing goes for building material and concrete and construction generally and timber and so on. This idea of throwing away can no longer be. And I think that there you need the role of the state to regulate, but you also need, frankly, companies to see, and the day we do get a price on carbon, this will be a lot better, because it is often much more effective and efficient energy-wise and water-wise and obviously resource-wise if we have circularity. So I think that in countries where it's very difficult to get rid of your garbage, circularity has, because it's regulated and there are instruments in place, circularity is happening in sectors. In countries where you can discard, still open dumping, what have you, less so. Which is why, for example, some of the other agreements that UNEP has the pleasure of hosting, the conventions, that Basel Convention, for example, that deals with transboundary transport of waste, is so important, because the moment you can't sort of export your dirt anymore, there is a reality that can drive towards circularity, efficiency, less water use, less land use, less resources overall, and that's good for everybody. And finally, food waste. Let's be a little mindful of that. If food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter. So let's make sure that we produce the food, but also that we distribute it, and that we don't discard it just because we don't like the shape of it or its particular ugliness of one particular fruit or other. So the whole idea of using what we produce efficiently, equitably, becomes very important too.
Thanks. David Cooper, I'll give you about a minute to answer. Then we've got two more questions that I want to capture before we close the conference. So go ahead, please.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight how biodiversity can actually also directly contribute to productivity in that area that's most tightly linked with biodiversity, perhaps, and that is food and agriculture. So obviously, our improvements in crop yields are due to making use through plant breeders and through the knowledge of farmers, the genetic diversity of our crops and our livestock, and then that biodiversity on farms beyond that is really important in productivity as well, in ensuring soil fertility. And for example, if we want to reduce yield gaps, we need to restore and protect pollinators, particularly for those crops that provide our nutrients. So biodiversity is also part of the solution. It's not only looking at reducing the impacts of biodiversity, but also making better use of biodiversity in these systems to support production. And of course, more generally, if we don't invest in a preventative way in protecting ecosystems, see the sorts of losses that economies face, whether it's from flooding, from wildfires, or from pandemics like the current one. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to try to get through 2 more questions before we close. So the next question brings us back to conservations, and more specifically species conservation, the efforts. It's a question from Daniil Studnev of TASS. And Daniil talks about the example of the Siberian or the Amur tigers. They were saved when Russia became the first country in the world to grant them full protection. And now we're looking at, according to his statistics, about 500 of them are living in the wild, with 95% of them in Russia's far east. So what does this experience tell us, this Russian experience tell us in terms of saving wild subspecies, and what does it recommend to other countries in terms of the approach they took or other ways moving forward? And for example, he cites the notion of Bengal tigers. Bengal tigers are threatened by poaching, loss and fragmentation of habitat. I'm looking at this. So if I could start with maybe Elizabeth, look at these more specific conservation outcomes, and then we'll move on to Inger and then on after that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. The Russian experience clearly teaches us that where appropriate policies and legal frameworks are in place, creating that enabling environment, just as the GBO report has indicated, policies work, and this is what we are seeing. At least the framework enabling environment was in place, which enabled the increase in this number of species, and that is key. Policies, legal frameworks, enforcement that create that enabling environment is important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Executive Director? Pardon me, everybody. Let's try here. The little buttons. I'm okay. Let's see. Inger, can you push it? Oh, no, Elizabeth is fine. It's Inger. We're trying to get her sound back up here. Pardon me, everybody. Yeah, no, we still don't have you there. I fear we're all hitting buttons at the same time. It's possible we're canceling each other out. Okay, she'll stop. Okay, I'll see here. So it tells me that I can click and unmute.
Okay, thank
you.
There,
you're on.
Thank you.
Good. Sorry about that. Yes.
All right. So thank you, Amur Tiger. Let me just, that was a moment of panic here. So
I know exactly.
First point is we need to just say conservation works, right? Conservation works. That's a big takeaway. It is not, you can bring species back that are nearly on the brink by good conservation measures, right? But once they're gone, they're obviously gone forever. So that's a big takeaway. Then secondly, Elizabeth spoke to legal frameworks, enforcement, etc. Agreed, check, right? Having clear leadership from the top to the bottom, number 2. 3, involve communities, obviously, because if the large carnivores are taking sheep and there's no compensation, if they are taking even children, well, guess what? You and I too would defend our families. So involve communities and find solutions and deal with human-wildlife conflict. Next, 4, ensure that we take a habitat approach, right? So it's not enough, it's good to focus on a large charismatic because people can identify, but don't just focus on the large charismatic, deal with an entire habitat, because in so doing, not only are we conserving that large charismatic, but we are conserving everything else within that habitat. And that's what matters for, of course, deal with fragmentation. Because it's fragmentation, especially when you have large carnivores and large cats, such as here, that it makes this very difficult to manage. And last, I'd say, accept species equity. You need that soil fertility and those millions of microbes in the soil as much as you need the Amur tiger. You need the ugly ones and the beautiful ones, the charismatic ones and the horrible ones, because all of the ecosystem is this finely attuned system that hangs together. So I think there are some really important lessons here, but leadership at the top matters, and that goes for any, and we've seen so many conservation programs that work, that deliver returns to nature. But once a species is gone, it's gone forever. Let me hand it back over to you, David.
Great, thank you very much. We're coming to the end, so I'm going to move on to the last question, but that was excellent. I think the last question is a good way to close up. The last question comes from Mayumi Nobuta of the Mainichi newspaper in Japan. And so this is going to talk to us about the targets, their conceptualization, what it means moving forward. So her question is that the Aichi targets were supposed to be specific, measurable, and achievable. And so, we're seeing this outcome today that the targets haven't been fully achieved. And so does that relate to the fact that they were not specific, measurable, or achievable? And then I guess the real question that we can bring into it is that what does that mean as we create these targets for the next round of the framework? So what I'll do is I'll start with the Executive Secretary, then I'll move on to David, but everyone gets a chance to answer in this last closing part of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think we have alluded and responded to that question earlier on. Indeed, the H biodiversity targets were smart as expected. But as we have learned from it, the implementation thereafter has had challenges. The timing at which implementation began also had challenges. And the measurable mechanism to measure the smartness, the measurability of the indicators was not in place until very much towards the end. So all these factors basically were more related to implementation of the SMART targets then, and the infrastructure which had been put in place and envisaged for its implementation. And not forgetting also the engagement of the different stakeholders to support the implementation. And stakeholder is both different sectors, both at government level, but also the private sector, the business, the NGOs, the women, the youth, different, but also sectors at national level. And of course, the major issue which had been underlined, political will at the highest level to really see the implementation moving on. And lastly, the alignment between the national targets and the global targets. Only 10% of the national targets were aligned directly to Aichi biodiversity targets. And that then affect the measuring of meeting the global targets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David Cooper, followed by Executive Director Anderson.
So yes, we need smart targets. I think clearly the improvements can be made, but in the end, I think, as Elizabeth has said, it's not, we didn't fail to reach the Aichi targets because they were the wrong targets. We failed to reach them because we didn't have the sufficient commitment. So as Elizabeth said, the national targets were not always aligned with the scope and ambition of those global targets. So even if fully achieved at the national level, wouldn't have added up to the aspirations agreed in Nagoya. And then even more importantly, you need action early and supported to achieve those targets that are set nationally. Going forward, we need to make sure that we keep close watch on the process. We need regular stock takes. We need to see how the national targets, do they add up, as Inga mentioned earlier, I think, to the global aspirations that are being set. And then, if not, what course corrections do we need to make? So we need a very strong monitoring and review process going forward.
Thank you. Executive Director.
This time I didn't touch the button, so hopefully it'll work. So listen, much has been said. I think these targets need to be able to cascade up and down, and the same was alluded to before, but it's not good enough if only 10% actually add up to the other bits. So if we're going to reduce losses, it has to be something, and then the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, or whatever the post framework will look like, has to be aligned to these new targets. They may do other things in addition, but if we're not hitting those targets, then frankly we're not going where we need to be. Number one, obviously we can design ourselves into such a degree of complexity that the complex structure is so difficult that countries are simply overwhelmed by it. Recall also that countries that have signed up to the Convention on Migratory Species, to CITES, to the plant conventions that are hosted by FAO, to Ramsar, and to CBD, they're having to report, and to the Desertification Convention, and to climate, they're having to report on all of this. This is very heavy. So we need to find a degree of synergy to enable a poor country with maybe the same person having to sit and fill all of these things to actually make it workable. So the enemy, the perfect can be the enemy of the good. Finding something that is robust enough, that gives us a dashboard of showing progress. Science can then deal with some of the specifics, and that would be Anne's job. But let the Biodiversity Convention be one that drives the higher level of achievements, and that's what I'm calling for. This will not be the entire terrain, and should not, in my view, be the entire terrain of measuring everything, because it will collapse under this system. And then building a broad coalition around this, so that it is not just held within the environment ministries, and ensuring that the reporting and monitoring, as been said by others, is in place. And that is not an encroachment on national sovereignty. That is a support to national sovereignty to ensure that we build capacity, we build enablement, so that those scientists in those countries working for those various ministries can deliver. And then encouraging the community outside the convention, the scientists, etc., to help businesses come up with scientific targets, science-based targets upon which businesses can measure, so that when you and I go to the supermarket and pick up a thing, I will know its biodiversity impact and footprint. Now, wouldn't that be the day? That's where we need to arrive to. This is not delivered by the convention, but this is delivered by science. And I hope that that's where we can arrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Inger. I'm going to have Anne about a minute, and then we'll close with Ezekiel, because this was launched during Substa, so the chair of Substa get a chance to comment. But first you, Anne, a little bit on the comments that Inger made.
Yeah, quickly. So I do agree that if we have failed to achieve all of the objectives, it's really first and foremost because of a lack of political will. That really has to be said again and again. But in terms of what I see as a major criteria for success moving forward, among many things, one that really has not been mentioned, and which I see as really important, is our capacity to build a truly global biodiversity observing system. We really need to step up our capacity to monitor our progresses, just like the Climate Convention has a global climate observing system. The biodiversity world needs also a global biodiversity observing system, one where we agree on what to measure, on the types of indicators that need these measurements, where we have protocols that we can make available to countries, together with the capacity for them to measure both in situ stations as well as remote sensing, something that is integrated and that really allows us to move forward in terms of following our progress towards reaching these targets. Right now, we have a patchy system. Most of it is not funded through operational funding, but mostly through research projects, which, as you know, are very patchy and temporary, and nothing is maintained over the long term. And we need to break that circle and also trigger investment in that system to go hand in hand with the implementation of the post-2020 framework.
Thank you very, very much, Anne. Hezekiel, as chair of Substa, one last final comments from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Certainly, we need to work on the new goals and targets. I had the opportunity to be in 2010 in Nagoya when it was approved, the Aichi targets, and maybe we were more romantic or more aspirational on the many things we want to see in the future without going into the details in how am I going to measure, how am I going to see this in a concrete manner. Some targets are complex ones in terms of they have subcomponents inside, so you need to split them and to separate and to measure each one. So this is part of the challenge we're facing now, and in particular Substa was charged with the duty to analyze a possible framework and indicators, and we just passed through a peer review phase where we received more than 10,000 specific comments on the documents we're going to revise. So we're working hard on that, but we need to be aware that many of the indicators will depend on what exactly are we want to do, what are we really asking. And in some cases, the language, since we're humans, is very complex and difficult to put into adequate a language and units to measure. Certainly, perfection is not the best friend or is the enemy for progress, but we need to be practical, we need to be clear, easy to communicate with all people, to engage them and to see how they are contributing from the global perspective, from the national perspective, from the local level to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. We're already over time, and so we've got to move on. So thank you to all of you who joined us and asked questions and watched this press conference. And many thanks to our distinguished panel of experts and people moving forward in the fight to protect the planet Earth. GBO5 is available on the website of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Reporters, we can also give you access to the Trello board and other opportunities to interview some of these people in the days to come. Thank you, everybody. So good morning to you, good afternoon, and good evening. Be safe. Thank you.